G'day ladies and gents, and welcome back to Kerbal Space Program with Mags, and welcome back to Kerbal Space Center, this time in daylight. So today it's time for Mission 3 of my Kerbal Space Program series, and today we are going to go to the Mun. Jebediah already has his rocket ready. We're just going through quickly at the command center to see what missions are currently available. Now by default we have the mission to orbit the Mun, and we will automatically receive the mission to land on the Mun once we have achieved that. However, it's always worth going through the mission just to see if there's anything extra you can pick up, because some of these are quite valuable. And what we're actually looking at the moment, we have an orbital surveys of the Mun. We don't really want that. We also have one to plant a flag on the Mun, so we've picked that up. Now this is the new rocket that I've built for this mission. This is the Muna 3. Now I know for those of you who watched the last episode, first rocket was the Muna 1, where's the Muna 2? We'll talk about the Muna 2 in a second. Now the Muna 3 I've changed to a triple SRB setup with the guidance fins actually attached to the SRBs directly. Now the main reason I've done this is to cut down on the number of parts available. My vehicle assembly building is still restricted to only 30 parts maximum, and the guidance fins on the SRBs, well, they're not going to be needed once the Muna 3 is in orbit, and these are going to be held to orbit before release. So ignite the stages and we're on our way. Now the triple SRB setup is going to cause us a couple of problems during the initial climb. It's not going to be particularly stable, and more than anything this has come down to how I've positioned the rocket for launch. The booster stages are always going to want to rotate so that the weight of two of the SRBs is always on the planet's side of the rocket during the climb. However, you can see by the way that I've positioned this on the launch pad that this is not the case, and this means the rocket is going to want to rotate off-center during the climb, and I'm going to have to fight it pretty much the whole way up. The second problem with this is the guidance fins that I chose to attach actually are fixed. They don't have any movement in them at all, so all they are doing is stabilizing the rocket through the climb. They are not helping steer it. It's relying completely on the SAS system mounted in the pod, which is not incredibly powerful, and the gimbaling on the solid rocket boosters that I've chosen. Now the second problem that I've only just noticed is I'm having to use a lot more throttle on the primary liquid stage than I was having to use on the Muna 1. Now the primary stage of this rocket has actually changed very little. It's all about the SRBs. What this means is I'm going to arrive in orbit with vastly less fuel in that primary stage, so I'm not going to be able to use it to get through most of the injection to the Mun. And there we go, SRBs are out. And this shows exactly how much of a difference that single SRB actually made. I've only hit 74 kilometers. Now why this is enough to get myself out of the atmosphere, the previous rocket, the Muna 1, was able to push out 125 with very little input from the liquid fuel stage on its own. I'm actually going to have to burn the liquid fuel stage a little bit here just to make sure that the Muna 3 is going to slow down so much during this last part of the atmosphere that it doesn't make space. So a short maximum throttle burn, I'm going to try and aim for around 90 or just before. That should be enough to make sure that I'm not going to decelerate in the last 20 kilometers of the atmosphere, although it shouldn't be too much of a problem. Just passing 50 kilometers in the atmosphere should be pretty safe now to jettison the SRBs. So we'll get rid of those, and they just peel away slowly. They will continue through on a ballistic trajectory and land somewhere in the ocean. Now it's possible that they may rotate through to re-hit the rocket, so just a short burn to make sure I pull away nice and clear. 1 minute and 20 seconds to apoapsis. I'm still in the atmosphere. I'm just about to clear into space. 66 kilometers, 67, 68, almost there. And there we go, 70 kilometers, now officially in space. So a relatively clean launch, but not as efficient as I was hoping for. I've burnt about a quarter of the fuel in my main launch stage, and I'm yet to put myself into orbit. So I'm not going to have a lot of fuel left for the actual Muna injection. Now I'm actually going to start this burn significantly earlier than my apoapsis. The main reason being is this rocket is fairly heavy. However, this engine is not particularly large. I picked it more for orbital efficiency rather than anything else. Being this is a new rocket type that I haven't actually tested previously, I was a little concerned that the rocket, even under burn, may not have enough power to push the apoapsis out burning at apoapsis, and I didn't want to be burning with a heavy rocket and a potentially underpowered engine while falling towards the planet without actually having an orbit. Especially not when this burn is going to be almost 2 minutes, and as you can see the engines itself do not have the power to push out the apoapsis. It is slowly still closing back in at 47.2 at the moment, 47 even, 46.9, even under full throttle, moving right on the prograde vector, apoapsis is still closing in. In reality, now knowing how this rocket performs, I probably should have started this burn at around about 25 seconds to 30 seconds, and I should have been pretty safe. So I have burnt a little earlier than I should have for efficiency. but better to be safe than ruin the entire mission by re-entering the atmosphere. Periapsis is currently at negative 460 and climbing. About 45 seconds into our burn now, still going. So at this point I've pushed out my apoapsis to 104 kilometers. I'm watching my periapsis rapidly rise out of the negatives. 380, about to hit 370, and I'm looking at the distance on. I'm back to 48 and I'm now pushing the apoapsis away. So at this point I can safely shut down the engines and I can let the apoapsis approach and I can perform a second burn. 52 seconds to apoapses, and I'll wait till I'm much closer before I actually fire the engines again. I'm trying to conserve fuel here. I've burnt half the tank. I've only got a quarter of my tank of fuel left and I want at least some of this available for the Muna burn. So at this point I'm going to let my apoapsis close into about 30 seconds and then I'm going to re-fire the engines. 36, 35... and we'll start to fire up the engines, back to full throttle. Sitting on 30 seconds, 250 negative and rising. There's 170, 160, 150. At this point the periapsis will be rising very rapidly, almost to the surface. And there we go, we're in the positive numbers now, 20, 30, we've now officially got an orbit, but we're still in the atmosphere on the far side, 80, 90, and I'll cut the engines at 100. And there we go, 100 kilometer at preapses, 165 at apoapses. Not a perfect circular orbit, but it's good enough to do the job. I'm not planning on staying around up here for long enough for it to matter. Now while I'm up here, I do have a few new science experiments on board. So first thing, we're going to drop the magnetometer boom out. And we also have a temperature gauge on board with this particular one as well. These are two science experiments that I haven't run before, so we'll pick up a scan of the magnetic field while near Kerbin and the temperature near Kerbin, and we'll do the same thing at Kerbin high orbit. We'll also do it in Mun high orbit and Mun low orbit. So that's 8 new science experiments before we even land on the Mun. So about 10 minutes later, and once again we fire up our engines for our intercept of the Mun. Now this orbit is not going to be anything that can be described as clean. The main problem was during the initial launch. Because the 3 boosters twisted the rocket as it was climbing into orbit, it's thrown off my orbit. It's no longer exactly on the equator. So as this orbit extends, it's going to throw itself out quite wide, and I'm probably going to come into a polar orbit or near polar orbit of the Mun. I'm already out of fuel on the main stage, so jettison. Now I'm on the main fuel tank that has to perform the rest of the mission. Now that burn was significantly less than the burn from the Muna 1, so I'm going to be relying on a lot more fuel out of this tank. I'm going to have nowhere near as much fuel left, and I have to perform a landing in this tank as well. So this has just become very tight on fuel. I now have to really watch my tank for the rest of this mission. Now that main launch stage is going to stay in orbit and continually circle Kerbin. I'm actually quite happy that it's up there. I know a lot of people get a little funny about leaving space garbage, but what I want that up there for is at a later date I'm going to start having to intercept asteroids, and I'm going to use these launch stages from the initial part of my space program as practice for intercepting asteroids. Intercepting asteroids is actually one thing I haven't done in Kerbal Space Program before, so the boosters will be a good way of getting my eye in on it. So, burn complete. I do have a high intercept with the Mun, and about 10 minutes later I have entered the Mun's sphere of influence, which means start pulling out more science. Once again, the magnetometer boom and the temperature gauges from space high over the Mun. And of course a quick EVA to pull the science out of the magnetometer and out of the temperature gauge and load them into the command pods so they are ready for low Muna science. The magnetometer boom and the temperature gauge are one of those science experiments that actually don't need to be reset. You can just continually pull the science out of them for the entire length. These make them really good science experiments if you're really tight on the amount of parts you can take along, as you can use these in multiple locations without needing a scientist to continually reset the science experiment. Quickly stepping forward again, another 5 minutes, and we're now in position on the apoapsis of the Mun, beginning our burn, bringing the periapsis in so we have a nice tight orbit. Now I was aiming at about a 350 kilometer average. What I wound up with is a 361 apoapsis with a 343 periapsis. That's good enough. When I bring this around to periapsis, which is on the dark side, I'm going to perform my burn that is actually going to deorbit me and bring me in for landing. And now the reason why I'm doing it this way is At the moment, apoapsis is on the light side of the Mun, and I want to land in the sunlight, otherwise I'm not going to be able to see what I'm doing, and, well, you're not going to be able to see what I'm doing. So I let the orbit continue through, hit periapsis, begin the burn, down to 100 kilometers, 98, 70, 60, 50, 40, 30, 20, 27's good. Now we're going to let the orbit continue through, and I'm going to do the final part of the deorbit burn as I'm much closer to the new periapsis. Now I'm waiting to do the final deorbit until then, because I want to be able to see exactly where I'm going to bring this thing down. The lander that I've built here is actually quite tall, so I want to make sure I come down in a fairly flat area. Now I've done one more burn in here that was just to pull another 10 kilometers out, so I'm coming in at around 15 kilometers. This is a nice altitude for me to pick a landing site. I'm on the light side of the Mun, Kerbin is floating above me. Time to prepare for landing. So first step is to turn the SAS system back on and tell Jeb to line the lander up retrograde. The reason why I turned the SAS system off, this lander is not equipped with a solar panel. So the only time its batteries are actually charging is when the engine is firing. Otherwise the SAS system will just continually drain while you're flying through space, and you don't need the SAS system activated at those times. And this is why I wanted to make sure Jeb had enough experience points so I could demonstrate this for anybody who's been having trouble actually landing on the Mun. You don't need MechJeb or any automated landing mods in order to be able to put down safely. If you're uncomfortable doing it manually, the experience system actually gives you everything you need. All you need to control is the throttle during descent. So Jeb's lined up and holding on the retrograde marker. Full burn, and you can see I'm just bringing it out. I'm trying to pick my landing point. I'm going to land across this vector. I'm aiming for the far side of that crater for the moment. Now that's not actually the point that I'm going to land. That crater is heavily sloped. I have a tall lander. I do not want to put down in that point, but I want to descend down this vector. My plan is to land on this side of that crater. There's a large flat area that you can see just on the two craters to the lower right of the rear of my lander. Now where I'm going to land is just before those. That's my target zone. What I'm going to do is wait till the lander is just getting ready to pass over that area, and I'm going to do another burn. Now this burn is going to decelerate me and put me into a near vertical drop over this zone. While I'm bringing it in, I'll quickly grab the magnetometer and the temperature gauge from low Mun orbit. No need to EVA to actually pick this science up. They can stay in the science experiments until the lander is down, and then I can EVA out once I'm on the surface, pick those up, and then rerun the experiments on the surface as well. Now the one mod that I do recommend that everybody has installed on their Kerbal Space program, especially if you're a new player, is Kerbal Engineer Redux. If you look at my current altitude at the top of the screen, I'm reading it just about to hit 12 kilometers, but if you look at the little Kerbal Engineer gauge to the right hand side of my navball, you'll actually see I'm below 9 kilometers. This is because the gauge at the top is reading on sea level or average altitude. The gauge for Kerbal Engineer is giving me an exact altitude above the surface. This can mess people up. You'll often, especially on night landings if you're a new player, you'll be looking at the gauge at the top of your screen and think you have 10 kilometers of descent left to go, when you really only have 7. 3 kilometers worth of altitude can be a lot to make up when you can't see the surface until you're about to hit it. So we're in the middle of our final descent burn, and as you can see I'm bringing my drop point just to the south side of those two craters, and that is looking very nice. It's a nice flat area, and we'll begin our descent. As the capsule begins to drop, Jeb will automatically keep the retrograde vector lined up, so we will line up straight north and south perfectly. And then it's just a matter of monitoring our speed. Now altitude and speed is all you need to watch at this point in time. On the little Kerbal Engineer gauge down the bottom right hand corner, you'll see I'm about 5 kilometers off the surface and I'm moving at 48 meters per second. 48 is too much for the landing gear. I think the landing gear tolerances for these particular legs, I think they will take a 25 impact, but the joint between the legs and the fuel tank won't actually take an impact higher than about 5 to 10. So you really want to bring your landing speed down to below 5 meters a second for touchdown. Otherwise, you are likely going to break your lander. Now you can recover a landing from broken landing gear, but if they break and your engine happens to hit the ground at above 3 meters a second, it's likely going to shear the engine off your rocket. And at that point, you've got a stranded Kerbal on the Mun. So 3.4 kilometers and dropping rapidly, about 77 meters per second and accelerating. I'm just getting ready to perform my first burn. Now what I'm going to do here is 1 or 2 short, sharp, strong burns to quickly arrest my speed. Once I get very low to the ground, I'm going to do a very, very, very low thrust burn that should gently push us down to the ground. Quickly grab a crew report on the way down, because apparently I've got one of those to pick up. 1 kilometer and closing. So first burn to arrest speed, 70, 60, 50, 40, 30, 20, 10, shut it down. Now because you're letting Jeb keep the rocket on the retrograde vector, it's important to never burn to the point where you start gaining altitude. If you do, what will happen is your prograde and retrograde vectors will swap and Jeb will try and flick the rocket upside down. This is all fine when you're at 10 kilometers, when you're at 500 meters, it's not a good thing. 391 at 10 meters per second, still dropping, done another short burn to keep this arrested. Another short burn, just keeping it under 20 meters a second and under control, 250 meters left. There's 200 meters down, 14. Slightly stronger burn to bring it down to 4 meters per second at the moment. 130 meters off the surface. 100 meters. Just keeping it under control. 50 meters off the surface. 2.3 on a slow burn. Just keeping it down. 20 meters. 10 meters and touchdown at just under a meter per second. And there we have it. First landing on the Mun. And you can see why picking your landing area is very important. I picked this area because it looked flat from orbit. As it turns out, it's not. It's actually about a 15 to 20 degree slope, but you couldn't tell that until you're right on there. Those crater walls that look like they're only at about 20, maybe 30 degrees that you should be able to touch down on, are probably closer to 60 to 70 degrees by the time you get there. So, now with this touchdown, time to start collecting science from the surface of the Mun. I still have 938 meters a second of fuel on board, which should be more than enough for me to get home. It's cutting it a little finer than I would have liked, but it's still enough. EVA pack on, and we EVA around the rocket a little bit to quickly grab all the science from all the experiments and transfer it through to the command pod, so we're ready to leave. And of course we have to take a couple of minutes to pose for some nice shots. One with Kerbin in the background, and of course one next to the flag, the first flag planted on a body that is not Kerbin for this Kerbal Space program. Once all the shots are done and you spent a bit of time looking around, we jump back in, make sure all of the science is transferred through to the pod, everything is nice and saved, and then Jeb can spend a little bit of time wandering around and exploring, enjoying his stay on the Mun for a little while, and we'll bring him back in the next episode. Meanwhile, back on Kerbin, Valentina Kerbin, Kerbal Space Program's new female pilot, and the female candidate Jeb is getting a little annoyed. So far, Jeb has been the first to space, the first to Kerbin orbit, the first to fly by the Mun, the first to orbit the Mun, and the first to land on the Mun. And this was unexpected. So, last episode I mentioned I had to restart my Kerbal Space Program career because of a slight bug. Well, this is the bug. Now, either my Kerbal engineers are testing Kerbin's most powerful rocket engine in the vehicle assembly building at the moment, or the Kraken has moved into the vehicle assembly building. I'm guessing the latter. This just killed Valentina as soon as I put it on the launch pad. Thankfully it's fairly easy to fix. All I have to do is revert back to the hangar and then relaunch the rocket, and it fixes the problem. Valentina will be back in the pod and we'll try this again. Okay, so as I was saying, Valentina Kerbin's getting a little annoyed that I've been using Jeb for pretty much everything up until this point. Time for her to actually do a bit of a mission. Now, I've pulled out a Muna 1 rocket. I think I'm going to try a new launch profile with it. I reckon if I keep the SRBs on, the rocket will stay stable all the way through this launch, and she is going to go to Minmus. Now, Minmus is the second of Kerbin's 2 moons. It is a little bit further out, and it is not on a equatorial orbit. It's a little bit off-center, which makes it a little bit harder to get to. It also requires slightly more delta V to get there. However, it has lower gravity than the Mun does. So once you've arrived, it actually requires less delta V to land, and even less delta V to return. Overall, it's a bit of a 50-50. Some people think Minmus is a little bit easier to get to as your first objective to land. I actually think the Mun still is, especially in a career mode when you don't have access to patch conics or maneuver nodes, and you have limited amounts of parts. But it is another science biome to go to, and I'm going to leave that all to Valentina. Now, Valentina has no experience points, so she does not have the ability to lock onto a prograde or a retrograde vector. So I'm going to have to fly this entire flight manually. So this will be my demonstration for landing without pilot abilities. The only thing I'll have access to at this point is the SAS. So just coming up on 1,000 meters a second, going through the thermal shockwave. I have the throttles for the liquid fuel engines almost to zero. I have no need for them. The SRBs on the Lunar 1 will brute force us the whole way into orbit. I actually need to be very careful that I don't go too fast, otherwise this rocket will actually burn up on ascent. There we go, the SRBs are out, 125 kilometers on SRB, and because this is a nice balanced rocket, it stays center, although there is a slight oscillation. Now, if you remember my first launch with the Lunar 1 on the Mun flyby mission, once I dropped the SRBs, this thing oscillated terribly and span almost out of control on launch. It almost broke up. Leaving the SRBs on, the oscillation is still there, but it is very slight. The rocket is staying stable. Once we've reached the edge of space, we're up over 56 kilometers. I'll detach the SRBs and give a slight burn to make sure we clear them. Most of the fuel is in the tank. I've barely burnt a fifth of the tank, so much more efficient launch, which is very important since Minmus has a slightly higher delta V requirement to intercept. I'm going to need more fuel. There we go, we're in space, slight burn, detach the SRBs, and a smooth exit away. 2 minutes to apoapsis, so I've got plenty of time. We're just going to let this thing climb out to altitude, and I'm going to start my burn again at about 30 seconds. Now what I was trying to do here is set a maneuver node. Now I've upgraded my radar tracking station, but I haven't upgraded my command center yet, so I have access to patch conics, but I don't have mission planning yet. So I'm going to have to put the Lunar 1 in orbit and then go back and upgrade my command center. Now the reason why I want maneuver nodes available for this one is not only is Minmus not on an equatorial orbit, so I have to plan to intercept off-center axes to the planet, but I've also chosen to launch at a time when the Mun is actually between Kerbin and Minmus, so whatever transfer burn I try and plan is going to go through the Mun's sphere of influence, so I'm going to have to slingshot the Mun in order to intercept Minmus. So about 60 seconds later I start my burn from orbit and I immediately push the apoapsis out to 43 seconds. The Lunar 1 has a slightly more powerful engine on its primary liquid fuel stage, so it's pushing the apoapsis out without any issues whatsoever, so I really should have waited once again. Periapsis is at negative 390 and climbing, maintaining an apoapsis of 134 kilometers, slightly increasing as I'm slowly pushing the apoapsis away. Negative 300. Apoapsis is now out past a minute. 200. At this stage I'm just going to let this engine burn through. The burn is almost completed. Apoapsis is now out to 2 minutes. I really should have pulled back on the throttles and let myself approach. It would have saved myself a little bit of fuel, but this rocket has a hell of a lot more fuel than the last one did, so we are much safer with the Lunar 1 than we were with the Lunar 3. Periapsis of 100 kilometers achieved. We have stable orbit, and that is where I'm going to call this video. I'm going to nick back to Kerbal Space Center, upgrade my command centers so I have maneuver nodes available, and we are going to plot an intercept for Minmus via the Mun. Until next time, fly smart, fly safe, and I'll catch you in orbit.